Let's welcome Tarun Chitra from Gauntlet and Robert Leshner from Superstate on stage. We're going to cover a lot of things happening in DeFi, game theory, 50 other things, investing, everything that's going on. So, welcome.
Hello. Yo, don't fall asleep. Wake up.
It would be fun. There's a lot of coffee on demand downstairs. So I want to start with you, Robert. You are no longer working on Compound Finance day-to-day. What made you start the new venture, and can you tell us more about it?
Well, I think like a fish or an underwater organism, if you are not moving forward, you sink to the bottom and die. And sometimes you got to switch things up a bit. And for me, Compound is at a point where a lot of people can work on it without me being there, and it continues to succeed. Tarun is one of those people. There's a lot of people that are able to work on it in a DAO/decentralized format, and it's working. So I can leave. I probably could not have left multiple years ago. It probably would have died. And so I see bringing assets on chain as the biggest possible, meatiest, hairiest opportunity I can work on, simply because there's about $1 trillion of crypto native assets, and there's about $900 trillion of assets that don't live on a blockchain yet. And so by bringing that massive amount of assets that don't live on a blockchain yet onto a blockchain, it's going to create a lot more opportunity for protocols like Compound, for other DeFi applications, when there's way bigger and way more assets that they can interface with.
So is that we have a new technology argument, or the fact that this is now just the opportunity and it's ready?
I think it's just the opportunity. I think the world's ready for it.
So does that mean the institutions are coming?
The institutions are not coming yet. I think the institutions are not going to really come until the assets that they already hold are on chain. I don't think they're really that excited, in my personal opinion, to buy new tokens that were created recently.
So I guess help me then simplify this contradiction. So what is the 900 billion or trillion asset that you said we can come over and that not overlapping with what they want?
Yeah, well, no. So those are the assets they want. It's 900 trillion.
I see.
It's all the stocks, bonds, currencies, commodities, real estate, every asset that's recorded in old school, inefficient ways. It's recorded with spreadsheets. It's recorded with legal contracts. It's recorded with lots of humans and lots of courts to figure things out when they go wrong. It's almost all the wealth in the entire world is in a really bad file format.
I mean, that's a good premise for an opportunity. This is altogether enterprise software in Web 2. Tarun, you also have a big overlap with, at least historically, how Compound has grown. Tell us about what Gauntlet is and sort of what made you start it, and altogether, like what mechanism design falls into.
Yeah, I think, each cycle of innovation in crypto always has an increasing number of parameters. If you think about Bitcoin when it started, there was only really one parameter, which was inflation schedule. And once you pick kind of the endpoint and a time scale, you've basically parameterized the entire Bitcoin network, more or less. And then you get to Ethereum, and then now you have to parameterize transaction fees, you get to proof of stake, now you have to figure out how to deal with how MEV gets redistributed. Each sort of cycle has more parameters. More parameters means more efficiency, but it also means more risk and more stuff to tune. And from, what we do is really look at all the different parameters within the ecosystem and try to optimize them dynamically. I think over time, as things get better, hopefully the systems can optimize them themselves. But, it's, first you have to figure out how to do the research to do that, and then, run the experiments and then adjust things accordingly. And yeah, I think the interesting thing is that the mechanism design in this space has only gotten more complicated. Yesterday I gave a talk at the ZK Summit, which was, Kartik and I were just talking about this. He was like, hey, were there like 20 people there? I was like, no, there's like 500. There's way more people in ZK land than you think. And a lot of it comes from the fact that it's become as easy to write ZK circuits as smart contracts were in 2017. And that's, kind of an interesting...
That's a great sign. And then also increase the surface area, because now you have to look at 5 other things that you didn't have to when you were just doing Solidity. Out of curiosity, is there some really prominent example that you can talk about on how a Gauntlet simulation or parameterization has helped identify a risk?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. There's two types of, very broadly speaking, I think you can think of like risks in DeFi and in decentralized systems as having two sort of categories. One is sort of worst case risks. Worst case risks are, ruin, like the proof of stake network slashes everyone and goes to zero and now can't validate itself, right? Like that's a really bad condition. Or DeFi protocol has cascading liquidations and goes to zero. Then there's average case bad behavior, which is sort of like, hey, I'm an LP in a Uniswap pool and I'm like slowly losing all my money, even though I think I'm making money because I'm getting certain types of rewards. And, something that you have to monitor is, say, a centralized exchange happens to suddenly shut down without any warning. Well, there's going to be a ton of assets that are on that exchange that suddenly the DeFi versions of those assets are going to have to be at risk, and you have to have emergency governance proposals to kind of figure out, is this asset safe to borrow against? How much risk is there with the collateral that's being used? How much risk is there with the outstanding borrower? And so that's the type of stuff we focus on. But the average case stuff is like, how do you choose incentives for your protocol? How do you bootstrap things? Or how do you, adjust interest rates in protocols? And so there's a huge kind of gamut between them, and it's only kind of getting more complicated. MEV is kind of like second law of thermodynamics. It's like only increasing complexity every day, right? It's not like it's decreased. It's never getting simpler.
Out of curiosity, what's the new complexity on MEV with the introduction of a lot of L2s here? Like, how's that evolved since just M1 or L1?
Yeah, so I think the cross-chain MEV world is actually, even though, people have talked about, there's probably been more, chatter about, more ads sold on Twitter to people who are talking about cross-chain MEV than there has been actual cross-chain MEV. But part of the reason for that is that people aren't really doing things like cross-collateralizing across different L2s. Instead, people are just like, hey, we're going to have the same token in 3 different places, and they'll eventually get synchronized. But I think what we're starting to see in terms of L2 MEV is, a lot of the kind of data storage piece, like the different L2s are actually competing in MEV auctions. So like to get in particular transactions on a particular L2, you're starting to see the sequencers actually having to be competitive within the mempool. 6 months ago, the Optimism and Arbitrum sequencers were not competing to send fees or to kind of finish reconciliation. So the market, as there are more rollups, has actually bled into the mempool, and that in and of itself creates a new game.
Super interesting. You've both been in DeFi as founders, users, also investors. Robert, you hinted on what you're excited about here, but overall, kind of how do you think the DeFi space is evolving, and where do you kind of see the next few years lie?
Well, the biggest areas in DeFi are not in like the very basics or like financial things you can create. I think, for the last 5 years, almost, like the things you can do are basically the same. It's like you can borrow, you can trade, you can do perps. That stuff is not the exciting thing. What's blowing up in terms of like the surface area is how information moves with these basic things. So there's, so many more L1s, L2s, hybrid things in between. And there's this massive surface area of interesting complexity between blockchains. Like, how do you move assets between them? How do you move transactions between them? How do you move value between them? And what are all the opportunities that creates, whether it's MEV or whether it's, more interesting economics? There's a huge amount of work happening and opportunity in, well, how do you do all this stuff with different approaches to information itself? How do you do the same type of transaction, but in a way where we incorporate a zero knowledge proof to, let's say, change the nature of a transaction itself? How do you do the same stuff, but you don't leak as much value or leak as much information? And I don't think it's really the DeFi building blocks that are interesting. I think it's the different ways that these building blocks are going to be thought about as a huge overall system, not just one blockchain and its MEV, but all the different chains and transacting between them and the opportunities.
Yeah, I think, if you think about the last, 2017, you had sort of this huge speculation bubble that funded a lot of infrastructure and public goods of different forms, so that it was easy for someone to create something like Uniswap or Compound that was not sort of what the intended, I think if you look at 90% of 2017 ICOs, none of them really looked like anything particularly useful.
I think 90 is generous.
Sorry, yeah.
99.9.
99.9, yeah. But like the idea that the speculative bubble fueled infrastructure that made it easy for people to do very cheap experiments, I think right now we're kind of seeing that the ZK side of the world and the L2 side of the world are having that kind of boom. And inevitably, there's going to be new assets that come from the real world, like stable coins, treasuries, things like that. But there's also going to be kind of some notion of like, how do you deal with assets on all these different domains, and how do you kind of do that efficiently? And I think people will, now that people have these tools, there's been this huge boom that funded creating all this infrastructure. Now that you have all these tools, you're going to find very unexpected ways that people will make things that look like a Uniswap LP share, but takes advantage of either the ZK or multiple domains type of things.
So one thing that I feel like we have seen an evolution on kind of how people think about it over the last few years has just been around what does it mean to be composable? What does it mean to be kind of using these building blocks that are kind of DeFi primitives, and how does liquidity sort of come into play? And we're kind of seeing more and more of that fragmentation now with like multiple L2s, we're seeing L3s now too. Has that changed kind of your definition of what DeFi looks like, or sort of how do you think that overall affects or intersects with where we'd like to go, but like these things are making it harder now?
So if we think about the internet itself, right, the world was sort of singly threaded and synchronous for a very long time. In fact, it took like operating systems making it easier to do that for people to have asynchronous compute and like the cloud and things like that. In some ways, you could argue that finance has a very similar path, right? Like if we went to the 1920s, there was only one stock exchange and everyone, rushed to go trade in that stock exchange. But over time, as technology got better, people started actually doing multi-threaded, asynchronous, not all in one place type of settlement. And inevitably, that always happens the more you have complex requirements for different types of assets. So there'll certainly be fragmentation. I think the key thing is figuring out what technologies make the cost of synchrony, the cost of feeling like it's synchronous to the end user, the cheapest. And I think it's sort of, again, maybe this is not...
I was like, in this case, like the commonality would still be the TCP packet is what's shared, but is that kind of we're betting on bridging between two chains becomes way too seamless, or do you think that sort of blocks DeFi altogether from growing because we have to like make a zero-sum choice of where does my money go, here or there or somewhere else?
I don't think that there's going to be one representation of an asset on each chain independently in the long run. I think there is going to be a world in which synthetic representations are treated as effectively equal, and you have high guarantees of security for that. I think a lot of the kind of crazy stuff you saw in 2021 was people thinking that two synthetic assets on different places were worth the same amount, and that the bridge was safe, right? And like now we've kind of switched too far in the pendulum where it's like, no. Pepe on Arbitrum and Pepe on Optimism are really two different things, and there's no way that we're going to try to reconcile them. And I think the pendulum will swing back once we actually have a lot of these extra assurances, whether they come from things like ZK or MPC, whether they come from things like different user modalities for how users store things. So one of the things I find the craziest of the last 3 months is kind of the rise of these Telegram bots that people use to interact with. I'm not sure if this blog post is out yet, but I think Flashbots is writing this blog post that shows like the different distribution of front end volumes from MetaMask versus
Unibot, that's right.
Unibot, but there's like 20 of them. Yeah, and the different Telegram bots. The Telegram bots were like 12 to 15% of order flow going into MEV auctions right now, and they didn't exist like 3 or 4 months ago, right? So
significant.
So it's clear that like and some of the Telegram bots, you might say, hey, I want to buy a bunch of Pepe. And it basically has an MPC wallet that you might own some of the key shares to. And it basically will do something like, hey, I bought 20% of Pepe on Optimism, 80 on Arbitrum, but like you, the end user, don't care. You're like, I have X units of Pepe. That is a different modality than thinking about having the bridging, right? And like changing the user modalities, not only the transaction semantics, is actually quite powerful in what we're seeing a lot of right now.
But they're not the same asset.
They're not.
And some sharp finance-minded person at some point will find the opportunities inherent in that and make a shitload of money.
Is that talking about just there will be an arbitrage regardless?
Yeah, at some point, any synthetic asset stops being a mirror of the underlying due to some edge case that will occur at some unpredicted, unknown point in time, and will separate the cream from the milk.
I mean, I think we're seeing early hints of that with staked ETH. There's already a few versions of it, and you see a lot of nuance in how things are priced.
Very good example.
Well, I want to kind of do a similar version of that same question for you, Robert. You were kind of a lot early into thinking about compound chain and having an app-specific sort of use case here. How do you kind of now think about that space? Maybe comment on sort of what happened with compound chain if you're able to, and sort of now seeing a lot of things around OP Stack or the base or just seeing DYDX. What does that mean to you, and how does that feature look like?
Yeah, I'll try to sum the whole journey up in like 90 seconds. So long before there was a ton of L2s, before we got to this point, around like 2019, 2020, we started to say, well, what does the future of Compound look like in a multi-chain world? And the theory that we came up with was, instead of having a version of the market deployed on every single L1 that might exist or every L2 that might exist, where liquidity is fragmented, what if you could make one giant market with the assets that are native to each of those chains, and it just worked. And the approach we came up with was to have an app chain, whether you called it an L1 or what, an app chain that had a bridge to each one of these L1s or L2s, and it would allow you to do really crazy cool things conceptually, like having Ether native on Ethereum and locking that and then borrowing AVAX on Avalanche, without having to even like go through and like bridge your assets or send them anywhere. You just lock it on one chain and borrow an asset on another chain. And this was like a crazy cool concept. No one has built anything like this since, mostly because one, it's really, 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 really technically hard. And two, what actually prevented us from launching was we got uncomfortable with the security risk of having like 6 bridges. This was ahead of its time.
What could go wrong here?
What could go wrong? I mean, this was like a bad sort of like tech strategy to even get into this position, to have like 6 native bridges. I would never wish anyone to have more than 1 bridge. But we basically became uncomfortable with the risk of maintaining so many bridges. It was just a bad design in a sense. And we basically got to testnet, ran on testnet. We're like, we're never going to be able to run 6 bridges safely. Like, we're going to get hacked. And this is before bridges got hacked, because there weren't a lot of bridges yet. And we just said, like, this is too much of a security risk. Like, we have to table this.
So do you kind of feel like that argument no longer applies because it's so easy to roll up your new chain now? Or do you feel like people are just going to try it, but then we'll realize that it doesn't actually work, so we'll come back to a few big L2s?
Yeah, I don't think one project will be so ambitious. I think what you're actually seeing, in a sense, is like projects biting off smaller, more manageable endeavors. I think you'll see things where like, one chain will get assets somehow from lots of different places, but it still won't be like the crisp user experience of like, oh, you can do something on one chain, like, and it basically instantly happens on the other chain. We're getting closer to that. Like, there's like a lot of solutions that are like slowly cobbling this together.
Both of you kind of brought up UX with just what that bridging interface looks like. You with the Unibot or just Telegram bots. What are kind of some obvious things, or maybe even some non-obvious things, that can help make UX sort of the priority, where we actually get more people to use stuff in DeFi?
I think, for better or worse, even though I think maybe purists may not be happy with this, I think the MPC wallets are, I think there's kind of this unfortunate inevitability in that's the middle ground between users actually paying attention to their seed trays and security. Obviously, I think it would be great if everyone just used a smart contract wallet and, they had recovery and all of these newfangled nice things. But I think at the end of the day, the MPC wallets just are about 10 times better for the end user right now.
So this is the argument for people not having to remember or having like a way to recover their seed phrase if they forget, or the fact that they shouldn't be assigning things every time.
A couple things, right? Like, I think there's Gnosis Safe-like functionality that people get out of these MPC wallets where I can make rules that are like, okay, you're only allowed to move more than $1,000 if both shares sign. But if the transaction is less than $10, then you only need one of two. And, maybe that's, the Unibot thing rebalancing your portfolio for you, or like the Unibot thing going and getting yield for you somewhere. And this idea of having rules-based interactions versus direct transactional interactions, I think is like the number one thing that these MPC wallets are getting right. The problem with most smart contract wallets is that they still are transaction-based, and there's still kind of like the user has to specify everything, and it's very hard to do permissioning. Like, obviously, Gnosis Safe is like the king of this type of stuff. Like, they've figured out how to do a lot of this with safe modules. But I don't think safe modules have reached the point that like the Telegram bots, for instance, could use them. Like, the Telegram bots could do everything in Gnosis Safe, and there's a reason they don't. And a lot of it has to do with just like the access control pieces are still a little bit annoying to do. And I think MPC wallets are not going to go away. And yes, they're weaker security-wise. Like, let's not kid ourselves on that. But the average user of these Telegram bots does not know the difference between that and the first version of these things did the cardinal sin of making you type in your
Yeah, they already passed the test by putting the private key in a Telegram.
Yeah. No, I'm not advocating. I'm just trying to point out that when you're talking about UX, users already are doing this, and this MPC wallet thing is already so much. It's like the 80-20 solution for them. Like, I want the smart contract wallets to win, but I just think the transaction level semantics of them are sort of like annoying, and like I think there will be a way around it. It just might take a bunch of development.
I have a really counterintuitive and controversial answer, and it's one that I feel partly responsible for getting to this state of the world. I think the user experience of sending your money into a smart contract and hoping that it's safe sucks. I don't think DeFi has to work that way. I think you can rethink and re-architect things to come up with a different market structure, so to speak, for DeFi itself. But I think the idea that everybody sends like $2 billion into a contract is a really, really, really bad structure.
Are you commenting on the flow of how that happens, or the fact that it shouldn't land in a smart contract?
It shouldn't land in a smart contract. I think you can have a smart contract that controls billions of dollars of financial transactions and routing and value. But the idea of like everybody keep your money in a protocol like Compound and hope that it's safe, it can be done safely, but like it's not a model that should be done.
Is there an obvious better route?
I think eventually what we're going to wind up getting to, and there's approaches to do this, and I've been spending some time on this a little bit, is I think eventually you wind up with a market structure that looks a little bit like, assets stay in your own wallet or in your own custodian until they settle. And you can have complex systems and complex logic where you can like metaphorically do all the same stuff you do with a Compound and a Uniswap, but with like having more actual user control and custody over the assets themselves. You don't have to literally move the token into a contract to get the same outcome and the same logic.
You're very pro MPC wallet then.
Yeah, I was like, all I'm hearing is three people controlling where the money goes.
Well, no, not even that. I mean, like you can just like you can just architect an actual DeFi protocol differently.
That is a very controversial opinion. Maybe interestingly, I promise people that won't go into technicals at the beginning, but you're effectively defining a lifetime of an asset, which if you look at something like Cadence or any kind of that type of architecture, you effectively separate the ownership from the execution, and that's like a good mental model to think about this. You are also investors. Putting on your VC hat, what is interesting in the space right now as a upcoming opportunity or things that you think that are worth or finally ready for commercialization?
I mean, not to sound like a dead horse, but I do think the ZK stuff, like application wise, is the biggest open field right now. Probably like close to $10 billion has been spent on infrastructure, and we're going to have a glut of proving supply in the next 12 to 18 months, both in hardware proving and proving for different types of applications. And so far, the only application that's going to use these billions of dollars of infrastructure is rollups. And no offense, ZK rollups are a very boring application of ZK. All they're doing is effectively compressing a bunch of state transitions. It's not even doing ZK, right? Like, the succinct
just proving that
snark.
I did it. Yes.
You're right. A snark is not even using like privacy features.
There are no circuits in there. Yeah.
And the main point is that there's a lot of other stuff you can do with ZK. There's a lot of stuff you can do mechanism design wise. There's a lot of stuff you can do in terms of separating, execution from ownership. There's a lot of stuff that I think people were so focused on building this infrastructure to make rollups faster that they kind of like lost sight of like, hey, you could actually use it for other things. And that is the ultimate subsidy that is being given out to everyone who's thinking of a hackathon project, right? There's going to be so much proving supply in the next 12 months.
I personally am really motivated by the idea that you can actually use a blockchain to do finance, not in like a toy way, but in like a Wall Street will run on this in 10, 15 years way. And all the people that are looking to actually like legitimately bridge the divide between how the trillions of dollars moves and what we can actually do with a blockchain is the area where I'm most excited about.
Maybe just to dig just a little bit deeper, what's the most obvious thing that needs to be bridged? Is this by just convincing them to see it this way, or like a pure technical thing that's just missing for performance?
I mean, there's technical things, there's, like security things, there's infrastructure things, there's user experience things, there's bridging assets over to a blockchain things, there's, making things more private, because honestly, like the execution of how you do a trade on a public blockchain, it seems silly in a lot of ways.
Like MEV shouldn't exist. Is that what we're saying?
I think MEV shouldn't exist. Like
there's some impossibility results on that. So.
Yeah, but like Uniswap is the greatest thing ever, but it's not Wall Street grade. Like I get front one when I use Uniswap. I'm like, there's just so many hundreds of things that I think like all sort of need to happen before like, it goes from being like, wow, these are incredible proofs of concept, and like they do work, and like that's what's so exciting about this is like we are proving again and again that you can use a blockchain and contracts to do really valuable and important things. Like, yes, we've like proven that you can do it. Now we have to like harden everything and
make it actually happen.
Yeah, make it actually happen. Like the state of it today is not like what Wall Street's actually going to use. Like we're delusional if we think that.
Another controversial opinion. But actually, that one's no. I actually agree with that. That's not. Yeah. 100% agree. I don't know why.
Kartik agrees with it. It's not that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Ouch. It's okay. Well, my kind of final question to you is, kind of having been in this space for so many years and seen all these ups and downs, any parting advice to founders who are looking to start something in this space this year?
Have fun. Don't do something boring. Go wild.
Like I said, every cycle in the ebullience, there's a lot of stuff funded, and that stuff that's funded is free stuff for you to use to build new things, and it's been heavily subsidized. So you should definitely take advantage of those, because whoever figures out the first application that is able to monetize, get users, whatever from those new technologies will be the creator of the next wave, right? You could argue that was the
first mover advantage in this setting actually matters.
It really does. So like take advantage of all the free shit that's VCs have funded for you.
All the free ZK compute.
ZK compute, layer 2s, data availability, all of these things are like, there's billions of dollars of subsidies. So
amazing. Tarun, Robert, thank you so much for taking the time today, and really appreciate this conversation.
Thanks, everyone.